Good morning and welcome to the first meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2026. We have apologies from Elena Whittam. So our first item of business is to decide whether to take items 3 and 5 in private today. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. Our next item of business is our first evidence session on the local housing allowance. I welcome to the meeting Maeve McGoldrick, Head of Policy and Communications, Crisis, Ashley Campbell, Scottish Policy and Practice Manager, Chartered Institute of Housing Scotland. And we have Hannah Aldrich, Senior Research and Policy Analyst, Resolution Foundation, who is joining us online. So thank you very much and a Happy New Year. And thanks for joining us today. And we'll just move straight into questions. So we're going to touch upon the topic of the impact of the local housing allowance system. And I'm going to hand over to Jeremy Balfour. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and Happy New Year to everyone, and thank you for coming. The first question I expect you could all speak on for 45 minutes. So if you could just kind of focus in on the main areas, and that is what impact is LHA having on private tenants in Scotland in relation to poverty levels? And I don't want to start with you, Maeve.
I guess I'll cover poverty stroke homelessness is obviously part of the same thing. But on poverty levels overall, I guess the key couple of points to make are that more people are being made homeless from the PRS. So we've seen 13% of the homelessness applications now coming from the PRS. And the second point to make is that fewer people are using the private renting sector to move out of homelessness. So it was at about 8%, and in the past 10 years that's gone down to 3%. So effectively what we're seeing is the people living in the PRS sector are both inflow into the homelessness system because partly to do with affordability. It's hard to determine what sort of the causal link between affordability and making a homelessness application is. But sort of the data from local authorities shows that affordability is one of the key reasons behind that. And then the second point in that is that outflow from the homelessness system is more challenging. The fewer people are moving into private rented properties. And again, it's hard to identify data to explain the causal link between that, but it's highly likely that affordability challenges are one of the key barriers. And what you see a lot in the PRS is that if people have a shortfall, that they're trying to make up for it with different sources of income to try and sustain the roof over their head. But it's more challenging to move out of the homelessness system and into a private rented sector accommodation if you're not deemed as affordable under the affordability checks that a private landlord would do. So they're not going to open and offer that tenancy to you because you have a shortfall. So even if you could make up that shortfall with other types of benefits or different sources of income, you're probably not going to get access to the property in the first place. So inflow problem and then outflow through access problems.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to some of that later on. Ashley, I don't know if you want to just leave the mic here.
Oh, sorry. Yes, maybe just to pick up on that issue that Maeve raised about the shortfall in LHA. So yes, it's difficult to access the private rented sector in the first place if you're on low income, but the way that LHA rates are set is very problematic. The fact that they have been reduced from the 50th percentile of the market previously, which would have, in theory, allowed people to access the bottom 50% of the PRS, that was reduced to the 30th percentile. So you're already reducing the potential access to people into the private rented sector in that way that was introduced by the UK government. The UK government has also repeatedly frozen and unfrozen LHAs, so they're not keeping up with the actual cost of renting, which is, as Maeve said, a lot of people are forced to try and make up that shortfall from other sources of income. If you're already on low income, finding that extra money is increasingly difficult, and that's coming out of money for other bills, for foods, for travel, for other essentials as well, so that's forcing people into poverty. In terms of the amount of the shortfalls that people are facing, we carried out analysis or commissioned analysis previously published in 2023, so that's a couple of years old now. Since then, LHA rates have been unfrozen, but now frozen again. So I appreciate that the figures may be slightly out of date, but it's difficult to to keep on top of that analysis because the data isn't readily available to be able to look back on those figures. But from 2023, the data that we published showed that there was an average shortfall for LHA claimants across Scotland for a two-bedroom home, the most common size of home, of £108 a month. So somebody on low income having to find £108 just to make up that difference to keep a roof over their heads is a struggle. That differs across the country, so that differed from a minimum of £6 a month in Aberdeen up to over £200 a month in Glasgow. Those are not small sums. So the way in which the government in the UK is managing LHA, the uncertainty that's causing, and that stress as well for tenants not knowing if they have security, if the rent is going to go up, can they cover that? If they are paying a shortfall and maybe just managing, they don't know if next year the rent's going to go up and they're not going to be able to manage that anymore. So I think the way in which LHA is being calculated and managed by the UK government is causing a lot of challenges for affordability and increasing the risk of poverty.
Hannah, I don't know if you want to come in. Good morning.
Hi, thank you. Also, I'm just going to start speaking, but if there is audio issues, please do interject. So, yeah, I kind of want to caveat that, like, most of my analysis around local housing allowance has been at the UK level, but kind of setting the scene, like in terms of specifically thinking about poverty, the key thing about poverty, which the Scottish Government recognises, that it's something that you look at after housing costs. So the amount of your housing costs relative to your income is really, really important for that equation. And with local housing allowance being frozen kind of periodically and systematically, it means that essentially it's a real drag on living standards and kind of leads to an increase in poverty because rents inevitably kind of go up even if it's going up at a modest rate. It will inevitably mean that incomes are going down if you're not being compensated either by an increase in earnings, if you're sort of on a higher income, or an increase in your local housing allowance or your universal credit income. So essentially, the analysis that we've shown is essentially that freezing LHA is a real drag on living standards and sort of will drive up poverty, and specifically thinking about the child poverty kind of targets that Scotland has. Like one thing that our analysis UK-wide has shown, essentially that like abolishing the 2-child limit will lead to a significant kind of drop in child poverty, but that will start to increase again because local housing allowance will be a key driver there. It will be very difficult to kind of sustain a decrease in child poverty while local housing allowance continues to be frozen because rents increasing is just such a drag on living standards if it's not being compensated for through the social security system.
Thank you. I wonder, the second question I have is what impact is LHA having on the availability of affordable private rented accommodation for private renters, and does it have a geographical divide?
I can start with that one. So we, in the evidence submission, you'll have seen that we worked with Zoopla to look at their, so it's look the difference between, I guess, our data with Zoopla and DWP's data is ours is talking about new lets as opposed to existing lets. And new lets, some would argue new lets are higher than existing lets, and some would argue they're lower and then they increase. So it's, again, slightly hard to determine that. But in terms of new lets, what we found is around 8% of properties across Scotland are affordable. For if somebody's currently looking for a private rented property, that varies significantly. So in Annex 1, you'll see the table which outlines that there's variation between, for a one bed, for example, a £50 monthly shortfall. In other locations, that can go up to £200 shortfall. So it varies quite significantly depending on location.
Excuse me. The analysis that we carried out previously was showing very similar figures to Crisis. I would add to that is the theoretical percentage of the private rented sector that somebody on LHA could afford to access. In practice, they might be in competition with other renters, particularly in areas of high demand. So if a landlord has several prospective tenants to choose from and they're looking at the lowest risk option, they might not necessarily, whether it's right or wrong, they might not necessarily choose the person who is on benefits as their main source of income. So it's not as simple as saying, technically, according to the UK government, 30% should be available. We know that it's much lower than that because of the freezes, and MEV's figures suggest 8%, but in reality, the competition in the private rented sector means it's probably much lower than that as well.
Before I let you in, Jeremy, I know that Claire would like to come in with a supplementary, if that's okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Just a couple of points of clarity. The crisis paper, which was very helpful, but it's just to confirm, so the crisis paper says that 42% of Scottish households face the gap between the local housing allowance and their rent. Is that the figure?
Yes, that's pulling it from DWP source.
Right.
So the difference in...
Is it, because you mentioned new rents, is it different?
Yes, so our data, Zoopla, is looking at new lets, and the DWP data, which says 42% of properties have a shortfall in Scotland, is DWP data, so that's existing properties. It doesn't say how much that shortfall is, but they say 42% of private lets, of people claiming local housing allowance, there's a 42% of them have a shortfall of some degree. Yeah.
And then looking at the figures, because you do it by local authorities as well, I was kind of surprised that Glasgow's percentage is quite small, while places like East Ayrshire is quite high. So it's just talking me through how that, and I don't know if that's correct. It says percentage of recipients where it doesn't cover the rent, and Glasgow is 24%, and
I think is that the DWP data? Yeah, it's 24%. So we don't have access to the data of how much that shortfall is, but according to DW data, it says 24% has an affordability gap. But in our new lets data, when we're looking at Greater Glasgow again, it's saying that what's it saying? The shortfall is quite significant in terms of amount. So it's up to £100 for one bed and up nearly £300 for a 3-bed.
So the amount of people experiencing the gap might be smaller, but the gap is larger.
Well, you can't compare our data to DWP's. Right. They're two different. So one is existing properties, where there's 24% shortfall in Glasgow according to DWP data. Ours is about, if you were to look for a property, if you were currently looking for housing, anything on the market at that point in time is what our data is referring to. So they're different products, effectively.
Right. And then in talking about the rate, so in 2004, the rate was uplifted, or it was unfrozen to recalculate at 30%, which I think cost 1.3 billion, is that right?
In 24.
Yeah, in 2024.
Yeah.
I think the paper said the estimated cost of unfreezing would be, is it 2.5 billion, something like that?
So this isn't from our paper, but I read it from the other evidence points where it said it was 1.2 billion that was for Britain, not just for Scotland, the overall cost of the unfreeze. But the impact of it having Scotland is a reduction of the shortfall from 54% to 34%. So it's quite significant. It did have a big impact, but obviously very costly for the whole of GB. I don't know what the figure is for Scotland itself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Before we come in, there had been a discussion in regards to figures. So I'm going to bring Kate in just to clarify that before we move back over to Jeremy to carry on with the questions. Thank you. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, I prepared the SPICE paper that's part of the package. And Table 1 references where the LHA covers or does not cover the rent, and that was using DWP data. And above that table, I've written that Table 1 shows that 42% of recipients have their rent covered by LHA. So what I've done there is transposed the figures round as an error, so that should be 58% of recipients have their rent covered by LHA. So that would then match the figures that Crisis have used.
Okay. Thanks very much, Kate. Appreciate you doing that in such a short time. Thank you. I believe Hannah wanted to come in relation to the questions that Claire was posing, and then I'll bring you in, Jeremy. Thank you.
And thanks. Yeah, just to clarify, we've sort of done our own kind of modelling around how much it would cost to increase, to rebase LHA at the 30th percentile. And by the end of the Parliament, we estimate that at the UK level, that would cost 2.5 billion. But I think one thing to flag about the unfreezing, so it's only, in theory, LHA was rebased at 30th percentile in April 2024, which sounds quite recent, but actually it's based on rents measured sort of 6 months before that. And if you think about what the rental market was doing at the time, it was really rising quite rapidly, but the rebasing point came about like midway through that rise. So since it's been frozen, rents continue to increase quite rapidly. So in the short time since LHA has been rebased, there's been a big gap that's been growing. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to kind of help put that into context for you.
Okay, thanks, Anna. And over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you. I wonder if I just can come back to you, Ashley. Is there any evidence, picking up your last point to my question, that landlords are not going to rent to people who are on LHA because, as you pointed out, the risk? Has anyone done that? Is there also the issue of, with rent controls coming in, is that making landlords less willing to expose themselves to that type of risk?
Landlords shouldn't be discriminating against anybody based on their circumstances or their source of income. But I think in reality, we know that landlords are going to, if they have a choice, they're going to choose who they deem to be the least risk. And I think we do know that there has been a culture in the past, I think very outdated term to use, but no DSS, no benefit claimants. And I think Shelter did a lot of work on this previously about the amount or the prevalence of those kind of attitudes. And I couldn't say if that's increased or decreased, but I think we do know that the recent changes in the private rented sector, so particularly the emergency rent freezes that we saw during the cost of living crisis, the uncertainty about longer term rent controls, just the amount of different regulations and rules that are coming in, have made landlords more cautious. And this is maybe veering slightly off topic, but we also know that landlords are leaving the sector. So that's another factor that's reducing the supply of homes in the sector and reducing choice for people. So if people have less to choose from, that's reducing their options even more and increasing pressures on the homelessness system, on local authorities, on housing associations, and contributing to the housing emergency. So landlords should not be discriminating, but in practice, that could be a factor.
That's helpful. Finally, for me, and I think you probably dealt some of this already in the first question, but what evidence, particularly maybe for me, is there about how LHA impacts the levels of homelessness and use of temporary accommodation in Scotland? I know you talked about the in and out. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add at this point.
Yeah, and picking up on Ashley's point there about private landlords, we do have relationships with private landlords in our services where we're trying to provide housing for people. That number has dropped significantly over the past couple of years. But I would say our experience around that is, and the ones that we have relationships are willing to let to people, not just on benefits, but also who have experience of homelessness. But that pool has significantly reduced. And people are more cautious, and it's not so much because they're on benefits, it's to do with the affordability checks primarily, is our experience of that. Not to say that you could say that for every private landlord, but it's more about their anxiety over the shortfall in rent. And even if that shortfall was to be addressed, what we find is also needed, which is very beneficial, is a package of tenancy sustainment support to sit alongside it. So people are cautious about the concept of letting two people in benefits for both reasons of financial concern, but also to do with managing tenancy behaviour, antisocial behaviour. A lot of assumptions that go with that. So providing tenancy sustainment support to the landlord helps both the tenant and the landlord, and it can include rent deposit schemes, rent in advance for new lets into the properties, etc. So I think it's about trying to encourage, from our perspective, as many private landlords into this market and want to let this client group, and that has to have reassurances in it to do with financial and other support packs as well. But on your question about sort of the wider impact on homelessness, inflow and outflow is sort of the key point. But what we would also say is what we're finding is the people who are in temporary accommodation are finding there's a real disincentive to work or to sustain their employment because they're paying the rental costs themselves. So we have found a very, very small proportion of people that we work with have moved into shared accommodation because they want to sustain the employment that they're in. So they want to get out of the temporary accommodation system as quickly as possible. And that's not necessarily a viable long-term option for them, but it's the only option that's available to them on a low-income rent. And I think that's one of the key challenges in the homelessness system is shared accommodation rate, which comes in under local housing allowance, that you have over half applications are under 35, and yet a tiny proportion of people are using the private rented sector under 35 at the moment. I think it's the number 700 shared accommodation rates in Scotland, which is really tiny considering the volume of people in the homelessness system who are under 35. So the majority of people are waiting in temporary accommodation and waiting for a social tenancy at that stage. So I think, yeah, inflow and outflow, and also addressing the shared accommodation rate would be really key.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. I believe Hannah wanted to come in, but I'm conscious of the time as well, so if you could make it as succinct as possible, thanks.
Yeah, just to flag, like, I think a distinct issue for Scotland around homelessness is that LHA is less adequate for people without children. And in England, because we have the priority need category, those families wouldn't qualify as in statutory need of homelessness support. But in Scotland, it does. And so the fact that there is such inadequacy in the shared accommodation rate has a direct impact on demand for homelessness services in Scotland, which it doesn't have in England. So just kind of that builds on the pressure on local services. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. I'm going to invite Marie McNair in. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and Happy New Year, panel, and thanks for your time this morning for this really important session that we're doing, covering discretionary housing payments. So how are councils using their discretionary housing payment to help support tenants where local housing allowance doesn't cover the full rent? And is the pressure on discretionary housing payment budget to mitigate, like the bedroom tax and the benefit cap, leaving sort of little left to address the, and assist the local housing allowance problem? And would you also acknowledge that if the UK government had scrapped the bedroom tax this year, it would have brought in, it would have freed up £75 million to assist as well. So I'll pop that to Maeve quite a lot there in the question, and then I'll put it out to everybody else. Cheers.
Yeah, on DHP, I spoke to our services team about this yesterday, and we don't use it much. And it comes back to the point I made earlier that the majority of people we see now would prefer to wait in temporary accommodation and wait for a social tenancy. So it really is a tiny figure. About 1 to 2% of our members are moving into the private rented sector at the moment. That was about 15% 3 or 4 years ago in Edinburgh, whenever rents were slightly more affordable to the LHA rates. So because it's just deemed unaffordable, people are unwilling now to take the risk within a private rented property. But I think, yes, I obviously agree with the money that's being used in DHP to mitigate the spare rooms policy would be beneficial if it didn't need to be spent in that way, and it could be used, discretionary housing payment, to top up LHA. I think one of the recommendations I would put to the committee is to think about using DWP data around rent arrears in the private sector to better mitigate homelessness. So part of the prevention agenda, if they were to look at DWP data on those in rent arrears and use discretionary housing payments more targeted and more effectively, rather than wait for somebody to come into the homelessness system and then try to apply for it. So I think it could be used, DHB, in a targeted way around prevention within the PRS, as well as trying to incentivise people to move into PRS properties out of the homelessness system. But I'm not convinced it's enough of a carrot to get people to want to take up those properties. It's just not as safe as a social tenancy.
And is sort of data a problem, obviously trying to access that? Obviously, with a wee bit of a discussion earlier on about that.
No, so DWP rent arrears data is available. It's not necessarily, it should be part of an integration programme with the councils for more targeted prevention. And some councils are looking at that already, but you could do that widespread across Scotland. Thank you. Anybody else want to come in? Ashley?
In terms of how much DHP is available to help people with LHA payments, the analysis that we did in 2023 showed that if the Scottish Government was to cover the shortfall in the same way that we do for the bedroom tax, it would cost around £100 million a year. So that would be to cover the shortfall between LHA and the 30th percentile at that time that we've been talking about. we also did analysis up to the 50th percentile to say if we brought it back to the 50th, I think it was about £150 million a year. So we appreciate that that is a significant amount of money and probably isn't realistic for the government to be paying for in the same way that you do the bedroom tax. But as Maeve said, we could look at how to target DHP a bit better. Just to give a bit of context, last year about £3 million in DHP was available for people in the private rented sector. Out of that £100 million shortfall, so it's a tiny amount of DHP that was available to cover those shortfalls. So we do appreciate that the government has committed to increasing that pot by £2 million, which is really, really welcome, but it's a case of how do we use that to the greatest benefit, given that there's a £100 million shortfall or thereabouts. How do you target that most effectively, and how do you make the biggest difference?
No, absolutely, and £2 million is a drop in the ocean as well, isn't it? I mean, in terms of, it's very demand-led as well, you know. Hannah, before I move on, do you want to come in before? No, you're okay. So I'll just stick with yourself then, Hannah. Is there enough awareness amongst tenants of the availability of discretionary housing payments to cover the shortfall?
I'm honestly not in a position to comment on that sort of thing. I do lots of number crunching rather than talking to real people, unfortunately.
No problem, I'll pass on then. Maeve, do you want to come in on that?
Just the point I made before, people are aware, or else we make them aware, but it's still not proving enough of an incentive for people to be willing to apply for a private rented property, or when they do, the landlord isn't willing to take them on for the risk. Because ultimately, you know, discretionary housing payment is potentially temporary, and I think until you can provide that long-term financial guarantee, it's a bit of a sticky plaster.
No, absolutely. Final point to yourself, Ashley, if you get anything you want to come in on before I hand back to convener.
I get, just to maybe expand a little bit on the point I made earlier, there's maybe around £100 million a year shortfall, and 3 million or 5 million isn't going to cover all of that. But the money that's there through the discretionary housing payment system isn't just for topping up LHA. So it could be used to provide tenancy deposits, rent up front. Obviously, universal credit is paid in arrears, but landlords will want rent up front. So there are different mechanisms that can be used to support people through DHP. It's not necessarily saying that the DHP that's there is just going to mitigate LHA shortfalls. So thinking about the best way to use that money, how to maximise that money. If there are particular groups that could be targeted, we might come on to it later, so I don't want to say too much just now, but particularly the shared accommodation rate, I think something could be done there. It's a small amount of people, but a huge impact that it has on them.
Thank you. Cheers.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Claire Baker, and I'm happy, Claire, for you just to continue on with your line of questioning.
Yeah, right, thank you, Convener. First, it's some questions around the DHP funding, the proportion of the overall funding that goes to DHP. So I think it's a crisis paper. When it talks about bedroom tax mitigation, it says it's demand-led and it's doubled in the past 10 years. So it started off at 35 million a year and it's now 72 million a year. Do you want to just, because how has that happened? Is that because I thought the amount of tenancies in that situation would remain stable, so I don't know if it's increased rents or if it's more people find themselves in that situation or why it's increased.
It'll be a combination of both. So it'll be people in a, sorry, just to clarify, you mean in particular around mitigating the spare room policy?
Yeah,
Yes.
so it says that policy, because the big chunk of the money that goes towards these policies goes to that, and that has doubled, the percentage it gets has almost doubled.
And the reasoning behind it is for two reasons. One, a household can change over time, so it'll be a family household and then people will leave, so you end up having spare rooms within that, so therefore people need to make that claim because they're no longer entitled under DWP policy to it. Or it can be, in some cases, what we have found probably in the days before sort of the heated market that we're in at the moment, that councils would sometimes place people in two-bed properties that we find if there wasn't one beds available. And there is a shortage of one-bed properties. So I think on this area, I think our main message in the evidence point is not to advocate for ending the sort of mitigation of the policy at all by itself. What we're saying is there could be sort of more incentive programmes brought in to try and incentivise people to downsize from homes that they don't need, if that was something they wish to do, and move different location, etc. And as a result of that, you would also free up larger rooms, which we know there's real demand for family-sized housing at the moment, particularly with those that are in temporary accommodation. But again, the challenge of downsizing is finding 1 or 2 bed
the
properties.
alternative for them. Yeah.
So there is something that we should be looking at over the long term, rather than sort of, I guess, continually funding without thinking about sort of other programmes that could help sort of create more movement within the market. That's our key message.
Yeah. And you've also talked about private lets and described ways in which, whether it's a package of sustainability support, the kind of things that as an organisation you can support and encourage. Does the Scottish Government have a strategy for engaging with private landlords and thinking about the private sector? How do we make it play a role, and how do we support the private sector too?
I think this is a really fundamental point for us in this inquiry. I know is about LHA, but if we're to talk about the role of the private rent sector in tackling homelessness, it's not quite clear if we want it to tackle homelessness or if we don't. You know, the key question behind any strategy is, do we want to grow the PRS in Scotland, or do we want to decrease it? And I don't think there is a clear direction of travel on that question, because if you want to grow it, then you need to question, do we want to grow it for the low income cohort of the market, or do you just want to target it towards the higher income households and target social housing towards lower income markets? So we need to really think quite, clearly about what the long-term objective is for the private rented sector. If the answer of that sort of strategy is yes, we want to grow it, and yes, we want a proportion of that to be for low-income households to help prevent and alleviate homelessness, then what we say is what I mentioned before about this package of tenancy sustainment support, including potentially a national rent deposit scheme, etc., that really incentivise the market and provided that market stewardship to landlords. So this is more prevalent in England than it is in Scotland, because the PRS is used much more substantially for low-income households and for tackling homelessness. But historically, there was a proportion of the private rented market in England of landlords that by 20% of the PRS landlords that wanted to target intentionally low-income households because it was financially viable. It was seen as a model that they wanted to invest their properties in. But that requires the financial sort of security, and it requires tenancy sustainment support to mitigate any other risks that might sort of arise with that group. So we don't have that yet, and I think if we did have a strategy for PS in Scotland, that's what we would advocate for, to make sure that landlords were incentivised to let this group of people, and also that it worked for people, that the tenancies were sustainable and it worked in favour of their circumstances.
Yeah, okay, thank you. The other questions, I know we're pressed for time, Convener, is around, so whether if I know there's been calls around from the panellists this morning to increase the 30% percentile. Could there be unintended consequences? Could there be behavioural changes that if you increase the rent, if you increase the percentage, landlords will just increase the rent? And we do have rent controls coming in Scotland, but not till 2028. So there's some concerns that while we're waiting for the rent controls to come in, that could deal with that issue. Landlords are at the moment maybe pushing up rents before the rent controls are introduced, or are there behavioural changes that would have unintended consequences and actually increase more pressure in the sector?
And I think that's the Treasury's hesitation always about unfreezing LHA, is that it will have a potential inflation rate in those broad rental market areas. I think that you could say that was potentially a justifiable concern 10 years ago, but because rent is so out of pace with LHA now, if you were to increase it, you're just making up a huge shortfall. So you might want to think about sort of, if you did unfreeze it and think about it going forward, of putting in different types of protections to, and for example, a couple of us I know in the evidence session have said, look with caution at those market areas and how LHA rates are set based on local variation. I think that's probably the best way to try and control it, to ensure that you do have sort of realistic rents and they aren't being inflated. But no, I think in the very immediate, with how much rents have increased, and that's partly to do with landlords' mortgage interest rates shooting up over the past couple of years as well, which is why we've seen such a significant spike in rents going up, that that shortfall is legitimate, and any sort of unfreezing of it will just bring it back to where it needs to be, rather than immediately inflating a market, is our theory on that.
Ashley, do you want to come in on it?
Just the point that you raised on rent control, I think it's going to take quite a long time for that to come into place. Local authorities are due to report and make their first recommendations on whether or not rent control should be introduced in their area in 2027. So it's still quite a way off, and we are concerned that it could be open to challenge. It might, in reality, take longer than that. Rent control measures in and of themselves are not going to bring rents down. There will still be increases available under the rent control system. We don't exactly know what that looks like or what the impact is. But really, I don't want to stray off topic, but affordability issues are linked to housing supply. And we need to increase housing supply to make sure that there's more choice for people and that landlords can't just charge whatever they want and increase rents like that. We carried out a survey of local authorities in 2021 as part of work on rapid rehousing transition plans. Local authorities' plans to reduce the use of temporary accommodation, transform homelessness services, and 30 out of 32 local authorities responded to us, and 70% of them said if they were going to make progress on tackling homelessness, they had to make better use of the private rented sector. But having said that, they needed to be, the private rented sector needed to be affordable, it needed to be secure, it needed to be a tenure of choice for people. We can't force people into those homes. And if affordability was one of the key issues, I think somebody responding to the survey also said a local authority said, if they allocated 100% of their homes to homeless households, it wouldn't be enough. So we need to look at increasing housing supply in the long term. In the short term, we need to make sure that housing is affordable for people.
So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire. I don't know if Hannah wanted to come in just before I move on.
Yeah, just on the point that could rebasing LHA lead to rent inflation, I think broadly one of the reasons why it's unlikely, I think it's a possibility in isolated cases, it's a likelihood. But I think we're in a very different system now to what we were in before, in that most people who receive universal credit and get the housing element, it goes directly into their bank account. So the landlord doesn't actually know that this is someone who suddenly has more income and I can increase the rent. So I think the risk that it will lead to rent inflation is much lower than what it would have been. And I think there's very little evidence to suggest that it would kind of push up rents dramatically, given the size of the gap that there is at the moment.
The coverage of any kind of benefit increase would be well known by landlords. I'm not saying that, I'm not disagreeing with you about what the impact might be on rent inflation, but I would say that I think they would be aware if there was a change to that. It would any kind of changes to benefits are kind of national stories.
The landlord might not necessarily know which, say if they've got 10 tenancies, they might not know which of their 10 tenants has received that benefit, because it's not something that it's paid. It's a private piece of information that the tenant has. So they can either decide I'm going to increase the rent on all 10 of my units, or try and select the ones that they think that could apply to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Bob Dodison. Thank you.
Can I just check, is this supplementary or is this my own line of questioning?
Well, you can come in on this up and then follow on with your question.
Just wanted to check. I thought Claire Baker's line of question was really interesting. It made me think, about Hannah Aldridge on this, whether or not another welcome unintended consequence of reforming it in the way that was suggested would be that it would de-risk those relying on benefits in the private rented sector if landlords knew there was a certainty in those awards increasing year on year, and the affordability gap not increasing year on year. So as the flip side of the coin that Claire Baker was right to interrogate, quite frankly, is that it would de-risk the private rented sector from being to make them more confident to have those on benefits or low incomes in their sector to begin with, Hannah?
I think it would rely on, potentially it would rely on the government committing to permanently relinking to the 30th percentile or to a certain level, which has not been the way that it's intervened in the past. It's very much been, we're going to rebase once and then freeze again. And so that the risk is still there.
Okay. Now, if I've got this right, Hannah Aldridge, I'll stick with yourself just for the moment. The last UK Conservative government relinked to the 30th percentile in April 2024, but used a baseline a wee bitty before that, so it's not linked to market values of April 2024, but previous to that. The current UK Labour government has said at least until April 2026, it will remain frozen. And I'm looking at a Resolution Foundation report from October last year suggesting that any gain from the action in April 2024 may already have been lost. In that report, and apologies, Convener, if this is UK figures rather than Scottish figures, suggest that by this year the affordability gap could be at record levels, and by 29-30 that affordability gap could be 25%. So can I just check that that widening affordability gap for low-income families and individuals in the private rented sector is continuing to increase? And the statistics I've used, is that UK statistics? Is that Scottish statistics? What's the Scottish perspective on that, Hannah?
So it's UK data, and yeah, so that's correct. Because rent inflation has been so sharp since the last kind of point when they measured the market, we're on course to essentially be by the end of the year further behind than we were when it was last rebased. So that's the UK perspective. In Scotland, it's not possible to do that because of the way that rent levels are collected in England compared to Scotland. In England, it looks at the stock of rent, and in Scotland, it only looks at new let. So you can't compare like with like. But broadly, my understanding is that like rents in Scotland have increased quite rapidly since the last rebasing, but potentially not as quickly as the kind of UK as a whole. And I think one actually way that you can see this is when we talked earlier about the adequacy of local housing allowance. So 42% of people on universal credit getting local housing allowance have rents that are higher than what they're allowed through the benefit system. That level is 54% in England. So that's quite a big gap. But sort of about 7 years ago, that gap was relatively small. And so the gap has widened. And so Scotland seems to be becoming slightly more affordable compared to England. And we haven't looked into this in detail, but I wonder if the kind of the new tenancy that was introduced in the late 2020s has helped kind of stop rents kind of skyrocketing in the way that they have sort of south of the border. But they are still increasing to the point where affordability is an issue, and freezing LHA is an issue for Scotland, but perhaps less dramatic than what it is in England.
I think that's interesting. I think without putting words in your mouth, Hannah Aldridge, you're saying that the affordability gap is still increasing in Scotland, but at a lower rate compared to other parts of the UK. I see you nodding your head. I don't want to assign that paraphrasing to you if it's not accurate. Thank you. Just Ashley Campbell, Maeve McGoldrick, any comments on a growing affordability gap at a Scottish level? Any data that you have around that you could put on the record this morning? If there's not, that's okay. I was wondering if you have any data.
Just on the point about data, I think there is a lack of robust, clear data for the private rented sector in general. We don't have up-to-date information on actual rents. I think Crisis' analysis and what we carried out previously is based on Zoopla data, so advertised rents on the internet. I think that Rent Service Scotland actually relies quite heavily on advertised rent rather than actual rent data, and that is an issue with how we are calculating LHA and what it's being based on, because the difference between an advertised rent and the rent of somebody in a tenancy can be quite different. So this doesn't just apply to LHA, but I think coming back to the point about there being a lack of clarity around the private rented sector and the strategic direction of the private rented sector, we need robust data to be able to make informed decisions about how we want to legislate in the private rented sector. What is affordability? What do we do with LHA? And I think that lack of data undermines the Scottish Government's ability to make informed decisions about the private rented sector, in this case and in others as well.
Yeah, final question, I suppose. I just wanted to kind of check about, I think the figure that, and we bring yourself in, Maeve, at this point, but I think the figure that Hannah Aldridge used for if we can get reliable data and we peg LHA at the 30th percentile, and that is tied to it, so it's not frozen in effect. That could cost £2.5 billion by the end of the current UK parliamentary term. I suppose my question is twofold. Some will say there's affordability issues for the UK government to do that, and whilst I would like to see them do that, is there a case to be made that the UK government should at least commit to a guaranteed increase of LHA levels each and every year, be that 2%, 3%, 4%, that would give planned fiscal certainty to the impact on the UK budget, but also, just because we're constrained for time, I'll roll both questions together, and that is whether or not that £2.5 billion, is that really a saving, or is that money spent anyway by local authorities, the Scottish Government, individuals in the private rented sector anyway, and is the overall cost to society more generally in terms of getting people into employment and sustainable productive lives much greater than the £2.5 billion it would cost to invest in this sector? So a lot in that. I won't come back in for any supplementaries. I've got the wrath of the convener, but I promise to bring Maeve in first on those 2 points.
Where to start? I think in terms of some increased LHA, if it's not the 30%, any increase, of course, would be welcome. I think if I were the Treasury, and I've had many conversations with them about this over the years, their key approach to this is either you have a blanket increase for all of the UK, and then there's the risk, as somebody pointed out before, from their perspective, that you inflate the market, or that you target increases to where it's needed. So there's two ways of doing this. If you were to target the increase, and you could do that in Scotland, and Scottish Government have the powers to do that currently at the moment, so this is possible, that we could target it, and I take the point Ashley made it already about the cost of that blanket, but you could target it at those at risk of homelessness in rent arrears and those that are currently experiencing homelessness. And say the key, if you talk about how much money that would cost, you need to relate that to how much money temporary accommodation costs, which is significantly higher, and quite a lot of them are private rental properties that are being used for temporary accommodation at a much higher rate than if it was a permanent property. So it's a false argument to say we're saving money, we're spending it via temporary accommodation. But as I say, any increase would be welcome. There's different ways of doing that. The Scottish Government could do something. It's within its gift to do something in the interim until that UK Government, if they were to decide to unfreeze it overall.
That's very helpful. Any other comments from witnesses? Ashley. I think Ashley came in there. Sorry, Hannah.
Sorry, just a couple of quick points after Maeve's. As a UK organisation, CIH would like the UK Government to pay for it, and we would like them to pay for that across the UK, and our colleagues in England will continue to call for that from the UK Government. I think that there are things that the Scottish Government can do in the meantime, and as you suggested, any kind of certainty would be helpful in encouraging landlords to work with people on low incomes in terms of increasing or giving the sense of security to people who might be considering a private rented tenancy, and giving them a bit more certainty around longer term affordability. So yes, that would be very welcome.
To come in and over.
Quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, just to say, sorry, I think it's up the Scottish Government. Like it will cost money to make changes to LHA, but the Scottish Government can decide how much it wants to spend and then target it, then decide how to target it, rather than say it would cost this much to do X. It's say this is how much we're going to spend. How can we target it most effectively?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Carol Mockin in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Convener. And the question I had, I think some of it's been answered, but just so that we can be clear on the record. So much of the sort of focus of the evidence here and in other parts has been on restoring the LHA rates of the 30th percentile of rents, and we know that. But what do the witnesses consider? You know, is there any other calculations that we could do, or in fact any other sort of completely different methods of trying to help, you know, renters, low-income renters, to ensure that they can secure a tenancy? And some of the things you talked about was a strategy, you know, for tackling homelessness, particularly into private rented sector. Is that part of our strategy? Supporting people that may want to downsize, it's difficult, so we're mitigating that. And then the housing supply. Is there other things you think that we should add to that list?
I mean, I think that, yeah, they're the key ones from us. in addition to LHA unfreeze is the sort of help to rent schemes, we call it. So it's the combination of rent deposits and tenancy sustainment really are fundamental if you want to encourage, and that's the key word, encourage more landlords to let to low-income tenants, because we're not convinced that increasing LHA will do that now by itself. People are so risk averse. I mean, there are other things that have been talked about that we're not necessarily advocating for ourselves, but other people have talked about looking at the tax system for landlords to try and reduce overall costs in themselves in terms of they're obviously trying to cover their overheads, etc. So, or if it's not tax, if there's other ways to provide subsidies to landlords who are willing to let, for example, to low-income tenants, to try and incentivise them into the market, and that might provide more financial security from their perspective, but probably worth testing that out with private landlords. But ultimately it's about carrots into the system as well. We have some sticks with the rent controls, but we do also need some carrots to incentivise landlords to be willing and take risks, financial risks, to let to low incomes.
Okay, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, we've talked about financial aspects, so affordability, LHA, tenancy deposits, tenancy support schemes. I think more broadly in the private rented sector, there's an issue with enforcement and standards, which again might be discouraging people, tenants from going into the private rented sector. So local authorities have very little resource to proactively enforce standards in the private rented sector. And we've mentioned rent control measures previously. I think one of the potential issues with the new rent control system that's being designed is that it's going to be up to the tenant to challenge rent increases. So that relies on the tenant's knowledge of the system and what their rights are, and their willingness and ability to try and enforce those rights. So if you're a low-income tenant and you're already worried about affordability, you're worried about the potential of being evicted, are you going to challenge your landlord or not? And what kind of support systems are in place for that? So I think if we're looking at the private rented sector as a whole and its potential role in supporting low-income tenants and tackling homelessness, we need to look at improving standards across the board. So affordability is key to that, but there are other issues as well.
Thank you, thanks. And Hannah, just if there's anything else? No, that's great. Thank you, thanks, convener.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. And finally, I'm going to invite Alexander Stewart in. Thanks.
Thank you, convener. There's been very many good questions and answers already this morning, but can I look at where we are when it comes to the scope that the Scottish Government themselves would have to use social security powers to change the operation or to mitigate the impact of the LHA? What areas do you think the Scottish Government do have at their disposal to try to manage that situation? Maybe Ashley first.
So the Scottish Government do have powers that have been devolved to change the payments within universal credit. I think in practice we've seen that it's very difficult. So it's been done with the bedroom tax, but it was quite administratively heavy, I think, at the beginning of that process. It involved identifying the right tenants to make the payments to. I think in the early days it involved requiring those tenants to make an application, individual applications for every single DHP payment. But I think we've seen through the process of mitigating the bedroom tax that it is possible, and the government has worked with the DWP to make it possible. I don't think it's as simple as it looks on paper with the powers that the government has, and it does require negotiation, it does require administration, but it is possible. And I think the easiest way to do that is through the discretionary housing system, the discretionary housing payment system. It's not ideal, but it is possible.
May, anything you want to add?
No, I think that's what we would cover, but I think in our evidence we make the point that the Scottish Government could top up LHA through discretionary housing payment, and that would offer equal support to those in social rented sector, and that's just something to consider, that balance that seems a bit absent at the moment.
Yeah, because that option is available depending on what is done with that. Yeah. Hannah, do you want anything to add to that?
No, just echo what others have said, that like it is possible to do something, and the shared accommodation rate does seem to be a sensible area to target because the shortfalls are so great and it causes pressure on homelessness services.
And the other question is that what ways could the Scottish Government and councils address affordability barriers to entering the PRS for low-income households? Do you think there's anything within that process that could be achieved?
Yes, so through discretionary housing payments, local authorities are already doing that, so topping up LHA, some may be using discretionary housing payments to provide tenancy deposit schemes or other sources of support, and some local authorities will be topping up the money that's available, so the Scottish Government makes them available and local authorities can increase that amount. So work is being done, but it's not uniform across Scotland, I would say. Some local authorities are more proactive than others, some have put more money into the system than others, but local authorities are under pressure in lots of different areas as well, and there are challenges there.
Anything?
Well, just to add that in the Housing Act 2025, it contains a requirement for local authorities to assess housing support needs of households within its area. So again, that's a really good opportunity for councils effectively to start to identify people, particularly if they are in rent arrears and in low-income households, of not only how to mitigate that shortfall, but also think about in-household income maximisation programmes of employment support, etc., and other forms of accessing other types of benefits. So there will be a legal requirement to do more in that area for councils in relation to the homelessness prevention agenda.
Good. And anything from you, Hannah? You're content? Okay. Convener, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Alexander. So thank you for joining us today. We're now going to have a brief suspension to allow for a change of witnesses. I welcome our second panel of witnesses to the meeting. We have Sheila Haig, Customer Manager, Transaction Assessment and Finance, the City of Edinburgh Council. And online we have Les Robertson, Head of Revenue and Commercial Services, Fife Council, and Duncan Black, Deputy Chief Officer, Finance and Resources, and Chief Financial Officer, Glasgow City Health and Social Care Partnership. So thank you very much and a Happy New Year. We'll move straight into questions because we are particularly tight for time. And first, I'm going to invite Alexander Stewart in. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask similar questions as I asked at the last panel, but I think I'll probably start with the last question I asked because it's much more relevant to yourselves. So what other ways could the Scottish Government and councils address affordability barriers to entering the PRS for low-income households? Because that is an area that we've just heard there is opportunity to do something with. So what do you feel the Scottish Government and councils could do to address that? Let's start with you, Sheila. Thank you.
I think the DHP funding, which is specifically for citizens in PRS, is probably inadequate at this point for us to be able to make a significant difference. In Edinburgh, our budget for that is just over £1 million, and that's given the additional welcome 123,000 that we received in November. We have 398 claimants that are supported due to the LHA gap that they have between their income. And as Crisis said at the last session, it's very much a sticking plaster. It's not secure. So really, if we're serious about that, DHP perhaps is not the mechanism to support this, and it's real change that's needed.
Thank you. And Leslie Duncan, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I'll just add on to what Sheila said, that I agree that DHP is being used as a sticking plaster to cover a multitude of things, including the shortfall in the PRS sector. And really, we should be really looking for another mechanism to deal with this.
Okay.
Yeah, and I can probably agree with what's been said as well. So in Glasgow, we've only got about 1.5 million that's being applied, but from DHP in this way, compared to 14 million for a spare bedroom subsidy and £2 million for benefit cap. So it's a very small element of the overall DHP pot that's being applied.
Okay, so I thank you for that. So that gives us an idea of as to where we're sitting. The other question I asked was about what the Scottish Government had in its use of social security powers to change the operation or to mitigate the impact of the local housing allowances. And I don't know if there's anything you want to add, because once again, Shelton and others this morning gave us an update as to what they thought could be achieved, because there are lots of bureaucracy behind it, but at the same time there is opportunities if that bureaucracy can be managed to make sure that may be an opportunity to change. So it's good to get a view from you if there's anything on that.
I think that the DHP funding is very restricted in what it can be used for, and if councils had more opportunity to use that smartly and to target, to use real-time data that we can establish households in need that perhaps haven't come forward, and if we had more flexibility within the fund to support that, that would definitely make a difference for us.
Okay. Thank you. Duncan?
Yeah, again, I'd agree with that entirely. Flexibility is key, and the flexibility within the funding environment is also key. So, for example, the DHP element that we're talking about here is not mitigated, so we can only spend up to what we've been allocated. And as I understand it, there's no kind of carry forward element either, which is also quite unhelpful. But yeah, I mean, we are only really applying DHP in this way where we deem the household to be in a sustainable position or could be made sustainable. So it's really quite focused in terms of where it can be applied. The other element, which I would just want to briefly draw on, which I alluded to in my submission, which is around the administration costs for DHP for these areas. So it's very burdensome in terms of the nature of work that's required for the whole DHP pot that is being used, and the cost associated with that is a real hindrance for local authorities at the moment. So I suppose it's that recognising the admin burden, but also the flexibility of that funding as well, and the certainty.
Thank you. Les, anything you want to add to that?
Really, only to say that DHP was brought in, the thinking behind DHP was to help households through short-term emergencies. It's now been, because of the mitigations we have to do, it's now people are on DHP for years and years and years. That was never how it was envisaged it would work.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Jeremy Balfour in, and I believe Claire wants to come in as well. But just to make you aware, we are really tight for time, so if the members and panel could make their answers as short and succinct as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Just start with the first question and start with the other panel. Is that what impact is LHA having on private tenants in your own region in relation to poverty levels? And we'll start with the most important area. Sheila.
I think the LHA in Edinburgh is a particular problem. Whilst we have the highest LHA rates in Scotland, they're woefully inadequate in comparison to the growing rental market. I think that that people are supporting themselves from money that perhaps should be used for food. I mean, or family support. I mean, we've seen the Scottish Child Payment come in, and it's been very welcome, but I suspect a lot of that's been used to prop up rent. We continually review DHP because we need to monitor the budget, and there are times where we have to reduce reduce awards perhaps throughout the year, given further instability into an already unstable market. So I would say, particularly for Edinburgh, given the high rents, given the high numbers of citizens in temporary accommodation, which brings more expense with it, impacts greater on poverty, that we really need a higher solution. We need more social sector housing. The Council has a strategic housing investment plan where there are over 6,000 homes in the pipeline. However, it's not enough. We have 28,997 people on our Ed Index list awaiting social sector housing. And at the moment, we've had to suspend bidding processes for that to allocate to those most in need.
Yeah, I think that's a whole different area we won't go down today. I don't know if Duncan wants to come in.
Yeah, so I suppose the points you well made, and conscious of time, so I won't rehearse that again around the affordability part of this, which is key. Obviously, I've illustrated in Glasgow as well that we have that gap in LHA rates versus the 30th percentile market rent rates, and that really ramps up for larger apartment properties. Poverty is clearly a huge critical issue in Glasgow in particular, and I've alluded to that in my submission. The real important context, of course, again, which is in my submission, is around homelessness in Glasgow. I think what's probably of interest to the committee is that for the last 2 or 3 years, the proportion of people presenting as homelessness in the city who have come from private rented sector properties is about 8%, so it's quite low, and we've got about 20% of our overall housing supply in the city is about from private rented sector. But what is interesting, I suppose, is that historically, so maybe going back 10 years, that was about 12%. So you could read into that just linking it to the discussion I was listening to earlier, that some of the legislation from the Scottish Government to protect those living in that sector may have helped sustain some tenancies in there. So I suppose there's a positive story within some of that data. But what is certainly the case is that it is very, very difficult to achieve placements for people presenting or at risk of homelessness into private rented sector because of the affordability issues, but also because even sort of discounting that, it seems very hard to persuade them to go into that sector, and many households are almost preferring to wait for a RSL accommodation.
Les, I don't know if you've got anything different to add.
The two things I would add to that, one is there is a severe, and I think it was mentioned in the earlier session about the shared room rate for under 35s. That is a significant issue that we're unable to place any single person under 35 in the private rented sector because it's just not affordable. And the second thing is, because we're keeping people in temporary accommodation longer, the way the housing benefit subsidy works, councils are getting penalised, and in Fife it's running into millions of pounds a year in subsidy loss through temporary accommodation rent, the subsidy control that the DWP put in place.
Okay, thank you. Just again, for the time factor, is there any evidence, again, whether it's anecdotal or hard evidence, that private landlords are now less likely to take on somebody who was on LHA, either because it's LHA, I'm uncertain of that, or because of other housing factors that are going on within the country?
In Edinburgh, I haven't seen any evidence of that, but that's not to say it's not happening. I mean, in our environment, obviously anyone in receipt of benefit, that's a confidential matter which would never be shared with a landlord, and it would be at the tenant's own opinion if they wanted to do that. But I haven't seen evidence that we have some good relationships with landlords, and Edinburgh relies heavily on the private rented sector, and we do have our major landlords who we work with. So I would say that I haven't seen evidence of it, but I couldn't say it's not there.
And just Are you seeing any less property on the market? I think we heard from the first panel that there's less housing necessarily coming, people withdrawing from being landlords.
Yeah.
Are you picking that up as well in Edinburgh?
I think in Edinburgh we've seen a big shift into short-term lets. It's a lucrative area. It's far more lucrative than a monthly rent. And I'm not even sure if, I mean, the broad market rental area is a bit opaque as to what's included in that 30%. I doubt that short-term lets would be, because they're in the commercial sector. So it further restricts, you know, these are really high rates in rent, but they may not be, or they may be, but they may not be included in the broad market rental area.
Thank you. Les, anything from Fife?
Certainly, the number of tenancies available in the private rented sector is certainly down in the last 5 years. And that's more to do with the landlords' rising costs, I would imagine, the interest rate rises, the way HMRC deals with private rented income. And as Sheila alludes to, we've had 400 properties in Fife in the last 6 years move from council tax into non-domestic rates because they're now holiday lets or stroke short-term lets. So the housing market in that area is shrinking.
Okay, thank you. And Duncan from Glasgow.
Yeah, I don't repeat what's just been said. Definitely a limited stock in the marketplace. You're seeing that shrinking. I've got some recent stats. I can probably provide some more if that's helpful to the committee, more or maybe in a broader time frame. Yeah, I would, however, still stress the point that I don't have any evidence that you're asking for there, but what we do have anecdotal evidence for is households much preferring to wait for an RSL place than choosing to take the dip into the private rental sector.
Yep, that's right. Duncan's already spoken about homelessness and the levels of homelessness. I don't know whether Sheila or Les has anything else that they want to add about homelessness and LHC.
Yeah, I think homelessness is very challenging with the LHA rate, because it's not even the current rate. It's the rates from 2011 that we're basing it, that rents are based on, or a benefit is based on, sorry. So it's effectively a year-on-year cut in that area. And as Les has already alluded to, the pressure on local authorities to meet that gap between subsidy and the actual cost of temporary accommodation, which, let's bear in mind, is not subject to whether or not you can afford it. It's based on need. So councils, having assessed that need, have no other choice but to fund that, and it is a significant cost.
Thank you. I'm done. Yep. Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, thanks very much. And Duncan, thank you for offering to provide that information. That would be really helpful, I think, for our members. I'm just going to invite Claire Baker in now.
Convener, shall I cover all the questions? I've got a supplementary.
Yeah,
to that
happy
one.
to, yeah,
I'll do it all at once. The first one is just a supplementary to the questions from Jeremy Balfour. So Edinburgh talked about the high rents that you're experiencing, the difficulty of meeting that gap. Edinburgh's calculated within Lothians, with the BRMA, and Glasgow is calculated within Greater Glasgow. So would you support a review of the boundaries of the geographical areas? Now, that will, of course, lead to winners and losers. I mean, do you think that's the way to resolve this? Or because rents in Edinburgh is getting compared to, Midlothian and other areas where it's...
That one's up for debate, and there are very different schools of thought. Personally, my concerns would be that whilst Midlothian rents may be lower, they're probably not significantly lower, and probably because of good transport links and things like that, they're probably able to increase those rents. And we also have East Lothian to consider, which is pretty much an affluent area. So my concern would be you may not see the impact that you would like in that change if the boundaries were changed. However, it is a subject of great debate across the city as to whether Edinburgh should have its own rate. But we are the highest in Scotland for Lothian. My concern would also be if we increase LHA in Edinburgh and we reduce it in the surrounding authorities, that may impact on migration from Edinburgh, where our, I think we all admit that we do not have the number of properties that we would require to solve this. And if that migration into other local authorities was impacted, that could make the problem worse in Edinburgh. But, there are very different schools of thought on that.
We are a bit pressed for time, so I'll move on to the other question, which is, it's interesting to talk about flexibility in the fund, because the figures that we have from Crisis shows that the mitigation of the bedroom tax has doubled, I think, and how much it costs nationally. It's 35 million, it's up to 72 million or something like that in 10 years. So why are we seeing an increase in the support for that? Because you would think the tenancies would remain stable from when it was first introduced. And is there an argument that you could, which Crisis make in their paper, more could be done to try and move people out of properties or make it more attractive for them to move properties and free up some bigger properties? And that would then give more money within that pot for flexibility.
I mean, that was supposed to be the intended consequence, was to encourage movement. But we're not seeing that. And I think, particularly in the social sector, people see that as their home. And it can often be the family home. So there may be a reluctance to move out of that property. I think it's probably increased because of the access or the limited access to suitable accommodation, one-bedroom accommodation, particularly in local authorities where it was never it never made sense to build one bedrooms. It made sense to build 2 bedrooms or greater. So I do think that this will continue to be a huge issue. So if we had flexibility within that fund, however, more people may enter private rented sector. If we could make our awards, if it wasn't a temporary award, and the whole concept of DHP was changed, that it was a funding stream for councils to use. However, that having that uncertainty was for citizens means that they will be reluctant to move out of what is a very secure tenancy into something that they see as less secure.
Yeah, I maybe ask Les the same question, because I know that Fife has invested in care villages and Huskin invested in smaller properties aimed at the older population. But what are the challenges have you seen in terms of bedroom tax and how much that takes of the pot that's available? And has there been is it an increasing amount of money over 10 years?
Yeah, the only reason it's increasing is because rents have increased, and in the social rented sector. Remember, the mitigation of bedroom tax doesn't affect the private rented sector. We deal with that separately. So yes, flexibility on DHP. I think it would be better if we got to the situation where the DWP mitigated at its source, which was always the promise. DHP was meant to be a short-term fix until the Scottish Government and the DWP got their act together and mitigated for Scottish claimants at source. That's never happened. And because we've moved from housing benefit to universal credit for working age tenants, the workload, and I think Dunk has already alluded to, the administration costs are just totally insignificant. Every time we have a rent increase, we have to go in and manually update 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 records as such an overhead. So, having greater flexibility shows already spent.
So there are efficiencies that could be made within the current system that would free up some resources, do you think?
Just having the DWP was always meant to mitigate for Scotland the bedroom tax. That was DHP was meant to be a short term to get us to the point where the DWP could update their system. That never happened.
And then the final question I wanted to ask was around, there's calls for the 30% to be increased. When it was originally introduced, it was 50%. It's now been at 30% for over 10 years. And in 2024, it was reset. It was unfrozen and it was reset at 30%, but it has subsequently been frozen. There's an argument that if it was to be increased, there could be unintended consequences, that there could be behavioural changes from landlords, that they would increase rents. And we are in Scotland looking at introducing rent controls. There is a concern that while we're waiting for the rent controls, it's an opportunity for landlords to increase rents again. Can they creep up till we get to that? So how do you...
My concern there would be for people who maybe aren't in receipt of benefit as well,
Yeah.
who can't be helped with DHP or, you know, or because they don't have the source benefit. And, you know, I probably think that behavioural-wise, it would be natural for landlords who definitely do keep an eye on LHA rates to increase to at least that level.
Yeah, yeah. And Duncan, do you want to respond to the question? Because you've not had a chance to come in, this question and any other points that I've raised.
No, I don't think to add really. I mean, I think certainly uprating or unfreezing the LHA, I think is welcome, and certainly from the point of view of persuading more households to examine the private rented sector as an option, given that it would be perceived as more stable than the discretionary award, which is the DHP element. Anecdotally, our offices are seeing that as a real issue, is the sustainability of that as a housing option. But I do accept that it would have to be carefully modelled and understood. I don't have any data on that, I'm afraid. I've not done that modelling, but I think it's a valid question.
And the previous panel did also talk about the Scottish Government's approach to private lets and whether there needs to be more clarity around the importance of, or whether it's seen as part of the answer to social housing and to homelessness pressures. And they felt there was a kind of lack of clarity from the government about how they saw private rents. Is that something that you would agree with, that there's kind of not a clear message about what the expectation is on the private sector in terms of Scotland's housing issues?
I think quite often private landlords are demonised to a certain extent, and it's certainly in Edinburgh we could not function without them. I think, you know, standards, whilst there was an opinion earlier that standards weren't monitored, I don't think that's really the case. I think there's been a lot of legislation introduced that's probably disincentivised some landlords from entering the market. So I think we do have to acknowledge that they provide a very important service, and that, you know, that we keep private landlords on side because we need them.
And Les or Duncan, do you want to come in? Or it's fine if you don't. We are pressed for time.
I've not really any comments to make on that.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, Claire. I'm now going to invite Marie McNair in. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener, and Happy New Year, panel. I'm going to go to Les with my first question. How does the benefit subsidy system affect the cost of providing temporary accommodation? And Les, you touched on that a wee bit earlier. Would you mind explaining a bit more for the committee? Thanks.
Okay. Any person that's placed in temporary accommodation, we have to pay the full rent. It's not an affordability issue, so they're assessed. And then what the DD or DWP who pays the subsidy, because we pay it through housing benefit, is then limited to I think depending if it's bed and breakfast or other temporary accommodation, self-contained accommodation, we actually get limited to what the standard LHA rate is, and it's usually for a shared room rent. So basically, we could be paying £230 a week for temporary accommodation and only getting £90 a week back in subsidy. I think the figure in Fife, it runs into millions of pounds of shortfall that we have to pick up every year. Patently unfair. That we have no choice, we have to pay the benefit, but we are penalised. And I could provide over the last 3 years what Fife Council subsidy loss, if it would be interested in the committee.
Yeah, it would be actually. We wouldn't mind submitting it.
Yeah,
you know, written submitting. Thanks. Sheila, did you want to come in on that as well?
Likewise, in Edinburgh, I can provide the details of the significant costs. We have over 5,000 households in temporary accommodation, and that is increasing year on year, so that cost is increasing year on year.
Thank you. No, it would be an interest to the committee if you don't mind following up with that. That'd be helpful. How are you using discretionary housing payments to support tenants with where the local housing allowance doesn't cover the full rent? And obviously, you know, it spoke earlier on, £75 million of the discretionary housing payment budget is going to mitigation, you know, on the bedroom tax. What pressure has that on your budgets to mitigate other policies through?
Well, in Edinburgh, there's an additional fund that's set up that sits within our homeless team to support where DHP hasn't been able to be paid. Now, DHP may not be paid because that person doesn't have an entitlement to the core benefit, so you can't support them with DHP. But what Edinburgh actively do is we pay for rent in advance, deposits and removal costs. And that has been a significant cost to the fund. However, we felt it's necessary. I mean, we supported 196 awards for rent in advance, deposits and removal costs at a cost of just under £200,000 up to 31st of December 2025. The new funding that we got, you know, the 123,000, we've been able to make a further 21 awards in that, those similar costs as well, totaling 28,000, and that's just been since November. So our, you know, one of our aims in Edinburgh is to try and move people to more suitable accommodation, which is more affordable to them, and we feel it's a good use of the fund. However, it does impact on our ability to support people who just have general financial hardship that they could use support to meet their rental costs.
Thank you. If nobody else is getting the input, I'll just move on to my final question, just in the interest of time. Duncan, I know that Glasgow has a track record of being proactive about raising awareness of what's available to their tenants. Is there enough awareness amongst tenants of the availability of discretionary housing payments to cover shortfalls of the local housing allowance?
Yeah, so I mean, there's really good joint working across the teams in the city. So we have homelessness, which sits in my area in terms of the HSCP as a delegated function in the city. We've got the housing team in Glasgow City Council, and obviously the benefits team in the council as well. So there's a really good broad awareness of all the tools that are available to us to try and assist households. In the way that it's just been described in Edinburgh, I suppose. So, you know, we know that we can use it to get in early to assist households that are in difficulty, to try and prevent them becoming homeless if we deem their situation to be sustainable in the medium or longer term. If not, then we can use it for unsustainable accommodation to try and avoid that prospect of homelessness in different ways. So I think certainly the Council and the HSCP work really strongly together to utilise what is available to us to make tenants and certainly those at risk of homelessness fully aware of all the support that's available to them.
Duncan, anybody else want to come in? Is it okay? Yep, that's you.
Sorry, could I just...
Sorry, Les, sorry.
I was just going to add two things. In Fife, we do similar to Edinburgh, and if we're moving somebody out of temporary accommodation where they can't get benefit on two homes, we'll cover the rent. I would add though, since councils are losing working age housing benefits, it's becoming much more difficult, administrative wise, to actually identify these tenants when they're claiming their housing costs through universal credit, because we don't get that data feed unless they make the claim to us.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, thank you. I believe Claire, yeah, do you want to come in? Yeah,
thank you. It's just about the temporary accommodation. So Les said it. Robertson said it's patently unfair. I think it's 90%, I might not be correct, but I think it's 90% is paid by DWP and local authorities pick up. Maybe, sorry, I was trying to find the figure in my papers. But the problem surely is that we've increased the amount of people living in temporary accommodation, including 10,000 children in temporary accommodation. And we've seen a spike in the number of people, and that's due to a shortage of housing to move them to. It's a housing crisis that's creating the bulk of temporary accommodation because we can't move them into other properties. And we heard from the previous panel that people are also reluctant to move to the private sector because they feel there's a lack of security. So they're waiting for social housing, and we're not managing to build enough social houses to move people out of temporary accommodation. So that's why local authorities are having to carry the burden of people in temporary accommodation.
I would say the LHA rates are the 2011 rates in temp accommodation. So that's, you know, so, more than a decade ago. But I think the 90% that you're talking about it's 90% of that rate in some certain types of housing. Right. But the DWP don't make 90% of the costs. Right. I don't know if Les wants to come in on that because he's subsidy guru.
So, as I say, I will provide the figures, but it's nowhere anywhere near 90%. I think it's near 40 to 50% is covered. But I'll provide the figures. I don't have them at hand at the moment.
Thank you for that clarity, but you do agree that the numbers in temporary accommodation are increasing because we don't have enough social housing to put them in?
Oh yeah, definitely. And in Fife, because of the housing crisis, because we don't have enough houses, we're having to put people into bed and breakfast, and that's even more costly because we lose even more subsidy on that. Yes, but that's definitely the case. We don't have enough houses.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Bob Dodison. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. I want to ask a very specific question in relation to the £2 million from the Scottish Government to reduce pressure on temporary accommodation and to support a move into the private rented sector. Despite all the challenges in relation to that. Now, caveat, I'm sure you could spend that £2 million 100 times over. So I'm trying to identify the benefits of the money that has been spent rather than the sufficiency of the money provided. So I can see, for example, that Glasgow got, I think if I got this right, 169,000 to be spent this financial year and 620,000 to be spent next financial year. So can I maybe bring Duncan Black in just to give an example of how that money has been used? Because if we can evidence good outcomes, it's a strong argument with the budget coming up, for example, to see there should be additional cash in that area.
Yeah. So you're right, we received, as I understand, £160,000 to be spent by 31st of March this year and £620,000 to be spent by March next year. I think the awards were relatively recently announced, so this is my area, so I'm going just on my basic knowledge around this. I think a letter came out not too long ago around this, so we've set up a working group to look at this, and the focus, as I've outlined before, because of the context in Glasgow with poverty and homelessness in particular, the working group is really looking at how can we utilise that with a view to moving households with children out of homeless accommodation, out of temporary accommodation and into the private rented sector, which is obviously the purpose of that additional money. So that's what we're using the money for. Probably a bit too soon to talk about the effectiveness of that, I think. If that's fair, again, I can go away and try and find any more information I can on that, but it might be something to keep a watch on.
That's helpful. Now, I don't have the details for the figures that Edinburgh got. I'm assuming you did get something. You referred to 123,000, yep. Sheila. I don't know if that was from the same fund.
Yep.
Can you give an illustrative example of how that money can be spent? Again, so, sufficiency might be lacking, but positive outcomes that can create.
Well, that's we made 21 awards for rent and advance deposit and removal costs since November to move people from homeless into PRS. So we sat down with colleagues in the PRS team in the council and our homeless colleagues to look at the best way to try and develop a strategy for that, to increase the sort of communication links across the teams to ensure that we're identifying people who are candidates to move into the private rented service. But again, there is that reluctance because people would prefer to stay in a temp accommodation, particularly if they get a house. You know, Edinburgh uses link housing to support that function. And so, you know, we particularly find that people are quite happy to sit in that type of accommodation because it's almost a council house for them, and then move on to, rather than move into the private sector. There's also a move towards mid-market rent in Edinburgh that we see, people see that as a more secure option than the private rented service as well. So we see more movement into those sectors than we do into private.
Can I just check, Sheila, is there a case to be made, and the gentleman would be right to be in the committee in relation to this with the time, but is there a case to be made to say if someone was to take that step into the private rented sector, that could still be a short-term intervention and they shouldn't lose their entitlement to move back into the social rented sector, whereas the way allocations policies work just now is you have no housing need and therefore you lose your needs-based assessment into the social rented sector? Could we be more clever about that, Sheila Haig?
I think we could. I think, though, that, as I said, Edinburgh's waiting list is 28,997 people. So the reality of someone who is determined to be in quite a secure accommodation may introduce a bit of unfairness for someone who is desperately waiting on an accommodation.
I think that's fair enough. Les, did Fife have access to that fund? How was it used?
I actually don't have that detail, sorry. But it would have gone into the DHP, and if you look at Fife's DHP spend, Fife always spends more than our allocation. We do fund our own DHP payments as well.
That's very helpful, because you've basically just asked my final question for the other witnesses as well. Are you able to quantify what you spend above the allocations? For example, I can see that Glasgow's £1.33 million DHP spend. That's a heads up to Glasgow, coming to you in a wee second. What Fife spends above its allocation? Do you have that detail? If not, you can send it to us, but that'd be helpful to know.
I can get a breakdown for you. I don't have it at hand, but certainly we do certain things with our housing department. For example, people who are just onto universal credit, we allow them a 2-week DHP, which is funded through our housing service. But I'll certainly get the detail for you and I'll send it on.
Les, please do, and the detail of your last sentence, because you went mute for a second there. But
yeah,
don't I do apologise for cutting you off. If you could let us know in correspondence, that'd be helpful. And Duncan, do you have a figure for what Glasgow spends above and beyond, which is quite meaty, I understand, above and beyond the allocation? Sorry, Duncan, you're mute as well, I'm afraid.
Apologies. Yeah, I don't have the exact figure to hand, but I'll get it over to you. No problem at all. That won't be a problem.
That's fine. And I'm losing my train of thought. Sheila?
Yeah, we don't supplement our DHP fund, but we do have other funds across the council where that cost is actually being met. So I can get you some details of that in the terms of tenancy hardship funds and the fund that sits in temp accommodation as well. So there's a lot of hidden supplementary revenue being used by councils.
Thank you. No further questions. For all three witnesses, those numbers, not just DHP, but the wider spend there and associated outcomes, because if we're contacting government, we want to say, here's what local authorities are doing, here's the outcomes, here's what more you could do with additional funding. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Before I come in with a couple of questions, I'm going to invite Claire Baker to come in with a supplementary. Thanks, Claire.
Yeah, thank you very much, Convener. It was just for clarity that, as it was said, the maximum subsidy councils can receive is set at 90% of LHE rates, but that is from 2011, as Sheila said, and that average rents have increased by 60%. So I do recognise that councils are carrying the cost of the rising cost of temporary accommodation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. In terms of, sorry, did you want to come in there, Les?
Yeah, just for the committee's benefit, in the last financial year, Fife Council spent £2.071 million in temporary accommodation, and we got back £610,000 in subsidy, which equates to 29.5%.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Les, for coming back with those figures. It's much appreciated. I'll try and wrap my questions into one, because I'm conscious, obviously, of the time as well. So, witnesses have effectively argued that the LHA freeze needs to be lifted. That's quite apparent from some of the evidence that we've taken today and from the submissions as well. So, in looking at how we can reset it at the 30th percentile of local rents, I'm just going to put it out there in terms of what would be the benefits of this and the potential cost as well of resetting the LHA rates to that particular rate at local rents as well. In any way, shape or form, how that additional cost can be reconciled within, obviously, the tight constraints that we have on public spending at the moment. So, Sheila, I'll put that to you first of all, and then ask the rest of the panel if they want to come in.
I would probably be a bit bolder than that, and rather than set it at the 30th percentile, that we should go back up to 50% to allow greater choice in the private rented sector for people in receipt of benefit. I don't have to hand the cost, but we could work with my colleagues in housing to look at what that would cost in the terms, if we raised it by, to say 40% to say 50%, and what that would look like in Edinburgh. It's more difficult to get data now because you see housing element. It's not as transparent as it is for the data that sits in council. But we could do some modelling on that and update that.
Okay, that would be really helpful. Sheila, thank you. Les or Duncan, would you like to come in there as well?
Certainly, I think I don't have any way of sort of calculating the cost because, as Sheila's already alluded to, most of our working age tenants now on universal credit. I think your previous, I think it was said if it was done UK wide, it would cost something like £2.5 billion. Those were sort of estimates, but I would sort of allude to the preventative spend. I think every person in temporary accommodation or every homeless person who is putting it costs something like the council about £15,000 a household. So you're actually looking at that. If you increase that, you might actually move more people out of temporary accommodation, which would actually save preventatively people being in homelessness.
Okay, thanks, Les. And finally, Duncan, if you would like to come in.
Yeah, so I definitely support what's been said by the other two witnesses. Glasgow's in a slightly more unique situation, of course, because of the scale of the homelessness crisis in the city and the costs associated with that and the nature of the housing market. So, as I alluded to earlier, around 8% of those presenting of homelessness have originated from private sector housing. So there is an element of that. So if we can stop that happening, that helps. Equally, about 1.7% of all our people that we manage to move off homelessness, only 1.7% go to private rented sector. So it's a very small component of people that we manage to move on out of temporary accommodation are able to end up in private rented sector. So I would agree that if we increased the LHA rate, then that would be more attractive for people and you'd see that go up somewhat. But the scale of what we were talking about, and we're selfishly for Glasgow, where it needs to focus on is the housing supply and the sheer numbers that we're looking at, in particular from those with leave to remain that are presenting in the city. The scale of that is such that this would be of assistance, but it would not solve that problem.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks, Duncan. Finally, I'm going to bring in Carol Mockin, and that sort of wraps it up for our questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. I think possibly I was just trying to link my last question to the last panel, and I think you probably have answered the question, but just for the record, much of the evidence the last time we focused on the LHA rates of the 30th percentile of rents. So it was just to see if the witnesses had anything else they wanted to add about that calculation. Could we do it differently, or other completely different methods that we could look at that might ensure we get some, movement for particularly lower income people in their tenancies? Is there anything, Sheila, you would add?
I think I would add that the 30th percentile drops as soon as it's set, really, because new rents come along and increased rents, so it's probably never at 30%.
Okay.
So really, we need to probably set our sights. If we want to give access to decent accommodation in the private sector and to encourage people to take that up, then we really need to look at what's open to them. And at 30%, that's very limited.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody online want to come in?
Yeah, I would just add that I believe that, yeah, you could link 30 percentile, 50 percentile, calculate the broad rental market area, but the biggest problem we have is single claimants under 35 who only get the shared room rate. That would be better addressing a bigger problem for us than that generally couples, etc., who can get a private rented. Single people cannot really enter the private rented sector market at all if they're under 35.
Okay.
And I would support that point, absolutely. It's a massive issue.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for joining us as well online today. That concludes our public business, and we will now move into private session.